The birth of Christianity in Egypt, emerging from the deeply entrenched worship of Serapis, unveils a sure narrative of religious transformation, cultural appropriation, and ideological conflict. This revised understanding positions the first Christian community as devoted worshippers of Serapis, whose movement was ultimately supplanted by a competing faction that blended the worship of Serapis with the mythological figure of Jesus. The resulting conflict, the first true anti-Christian movement, was waged by this hybrid sect against the original Serapis-centered Christians, dismantling their traditions and identity. The emergence of Serapis as a deity symbolized the synthesis of Egyptian religious traditions with Hellenistic influences, an effort initiated under Ptolemy I. Serapis combined aspects of Osiris and Apis, key figures in Egyptian cosmology, with attributes of Hellenistic gods like Zeus, Dionysus, and Hades. This fusion created a multifaceted deity representing fertility, the underworld, healing, and solar power, making Serapis a universal god suited for the multicultural city of Alexandria and beyond. The Serapeum in Alexandria, a grand temple complex dedicated to Serapis, became a central hub for religious, cultural, and intellectual life. It housed the renowned Library of Alexandria, linking Serapis to the pursuit of knowledge. The Septuagint, a Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures, was reportedly associated with this temple, illustrating Serapis's significance in bridging religious and cultural divides. The rise of Serapis was part of a deliberate policy to unify diverse populations in Ptolemaic Egypt. By blending Egyptian and Hellenistic traditions, the Ptolemies aimed to create a shared religious framework to stabilize their rule. This amalgamation extended to other gods, such as Isis and Anubis, who were integrated into the Greco-Roman pantheon. The coexistence and occasional overlap between the cult of Serapis and early Christian communities highlight the fluidity of religious identities in Egypt. By the time of Hadrian, Serapis was not only a focal point of Egyptian religiosity, but also a figure around which imperial religious policies revolved. Hadrian's administration recognized the integration of Serapis worship with emerging Christian practices, noting the surprising overlap in their followers. While the rise of Christian theory ultimately led to the decline of Serapis worship, its legacy endured. The iconography of Serapis, particularly his solar and salvific attributes, resonated with Christian imagery, facilitating a smoother cultural transition during the Roman Empire's shift to Christianity. The eventual destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE by Christian authorities symbolized the definitive end of Serapis's prominence, yet it also marked the culmination of centuries of religious order. In the cosmopolitan and religiously diverse environment of Roman Egypt, the cult of Serapis held a unique position as a bridge between traditional Egyptian spirituality and the Hellenistic influences introduced under the Ptolemies. Serapis, a deity embodying universal themes of healing, resurrection, and cosmic order, attracted a devoted following. For some in this community, particularly during the formative years of the Christian theory, the figure of Serapis, being the then Christ, may have served as an archetype for understanding the divine role of Jesus. Hadrian's letter to Servianus underscores the fluidity of religious boundaries in Egypt. Those who worship Serapis are, in fact, Christians, and those who call themselves bishops of Christ are, in fact, devotees of Serapis. This observation was not merely an outsider's confusion, but reflected a complex reality where theological systems and communal practices overlapped significantly. The Serapeum in Alexandria, a central hub for the cult of Serapis, often served as a meeting place for religious debates, suggesting that early Christians, who were still developing distinct identities, shared physical and intellectual spaces with Serapis worshippers. The rituals of Serapis worship, including the promise of resurrection and the purification of the soul through mystical engagement, offered a framework that early Christians could adopt and reinterpret. These practices included symbolic meals, which bore resemblance to the communal breaking of bread in Christian gatherings, and the concept of divine intermediaries who facilitated the salvation of the faithful. Furthermore, the imagery associated with Serapis, such as the fusion of solar and chthonic elements, may have resonated with early Christians seeking to articulate Jesus' dual role as the bringer of life and conqueror of death. Emperor Hadrian's policy of promoting religious pluralism, particularly through the construction of temples to Serapis and other similar deities, indirectly supported the coexistence of various spiritual traditions, including nascent Christian religion. These temples often emphasized a universalized approach to worship, devoid of explicit imagery, which facilitated the blending of religious ideas. By situating Serapis as a divine mediator, Hadrian's reforms fostered an environment where the theological notions of Serapis and Jesus could coexist and evolve together. The blending of Serapis worship with early Christian beliefs is evident in theological constructs that emphasize the dual nature of divine figures. Serapis, a deity who united the underworld and the heavens, mirrored the emerging Christian understanding of Jesus as a figure who reconciled humanity with God. This continuity is not surprising given the Egyptian penchant for integrating religious traditions, a tendency further encouraged by the intellectual and spiritual cross-pollination of Alexandria. Far from viewing Serapis and Jesus as separate entities, many early adherents perceived Jesus as the fulfillment or extension of Serapis's promises of salvation. This transitional phase highlights a facilitating moment in religious history where the theological boundaries were still porous, allowing for a blending of Egyptian, Hellenistic, and emerging Christian elements. As Christian theory gained prominence, it gradually redefined these symbols and practices. But the influence of Serapis on the foundational framework of Christian identity in Roman Egypt remains unmistakable. The eventual rise of a competing faction within the Christian religion marked a turning point. This new movement sought to merge the worship of Serapis with the emerging figure of Jesus, crafting a blended theology that positioned Jesus as the true Savior while gradually subsuming the identity of Serapis. This faction actively distanced itself from the original Serapis-centered Christians, portraying them as heretical or misguided. Philosophically, this hybrid movement leveraged the universalist themes of Serapis worship while reinterpreting them through the lens of Jesus' life and teachings. The themes of resurrection and salvation remained central, but they were rebranded to align with the narrative of Jesus as the new Christ. This ideological shift allowed the hybrid faction to appeal to a broader audience, ultimately gaining the favor of Roman authorities and consolidating its influence. The religious evolution of Roman Egypt witnessed a profound turning point, with the emergence of a Christian faction intent on merging the theological framework of Serapis worship with the figure of Jesus. This movement represented a critical phase in the development of early Christian orthodoxy, wherein universalist elements of Serapis were reinterpreted through the lens of Jesus' teachings, ultimately reshaping the religious landscape of the empire. As the Jesus-centered Christians began to solidify its identity, this new faction deliberately distanced itself from early Christians who were closely tied to the worship of Serapis. These Serapis-centered Christians were increasingly marginalized and labeled as heretical or misguided, a tactic that not only differentiated the new movement but also discredited its theological predecessors. The shift was marked by a rebranding of core religious themes: resurrection, salvation, and divine mediation, previously associated with Serapis, were recontextualized as central tenets of Jesus' role as the new Christ, thereby subsuming Serapis' identity under the growing Christian narrative. The new faction borrowed heavily from the philosophical underpinnings of Serapis worship. Serapis, a deity who symbolized the union of opposites, life and death, mortal and immortal, served as an ideal prototype for conceptualizing Jesus as the divine mediator. This reinterpretation allowed the faction to frame Jesus as the ultimate savior who transcended human limitations, offering not just resurrection but eternal salvation. By adopting and reinterpreting these universalist themes, the faction created a theological framework that resonated with both the Hellenized elite and the broader, culturally diverse populations of Egypt. This ideological transition was as much a political maneuver as it was a theological evolution. By rebranding the salvation themes of Serapis in terms of Jesus, the hybrid faction appealed to a wider audience, including Roman authorities, who were increasingly inclined to support a unifying religious force within the empire. Emperor Hadrian's earlier policies of religious pluralism, which sought to integrate Egyptian and Greco-Roman pantheons, had already paved the way for such a synthesis. The faction capitalized on this groundwork, positioning itself as a cohesive movement that could bridge the spiritual and political divides of the empire. The eventual success of this movement led to the systematic marginalization of Serapis worship. The faction's reinterpretation of resurrection and salvation themes rendered the original Serapis cult redundant, and its adherents were increasingly portrayed as remnants of a bygone era. By the time of Theophilus and the destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE, the hybrid theology had not only gained dominance, but also secured the favor of the Roman state, effectively erasing the influence of Serapis from Egypt's religious landscape. The assimilation approach adopted by this faction had far-reaching consequences. By integrating elements of Serapis worship, it presented certain aspects of Egyptian religiosity while simultaneously redefining them within the Christian narrative. This blending of traditions facilitated the spread of the Christian religion across Egypt and the Roman Empire, ensuring its appeal to a culturally diverse populace. The theological and philosophical innovations introduced during this period laid the foundation for what would become mainstream Christian doctrine. The ideological and theological clash between the original Serapis-centered Christians and the emergent hybrid faction was more than a mere contest for religious dominance. It was a struggle over the power to define salvation, divinity, and the essence of spiritual truth. The original Serapis-centered Christians had drawn deeply from the rituals and theological framework of Serapis worship. Themes of resurrection, divine mediation, and cosmic balance were central to their understanding of salvation. In contrast, the hybrid faction sought to repurpose these elements, reinterpreting them through the lens of Jesus as the Christ. This reframing allowed the faction to claim ownership of these spiritual narratives, asserting that they found their true fulfillment in the Christian story. This new hybrid faction strategically positioned itself as the inheritor of Serapis' salvation themes, while discrediting the original Serapis-centered Christians as adherents to an outdated or incomplete spiritual framework. This process of redefining religious identity often involves both conflict and negotiation. The hybrid faction's success lay in its ability to co-opt the established rituals and theological concepts of Serapis worship, presenting them as uniquely Christian innovations. This transformation was not merely an erasure of Serapis, but a synthesis that incorporated his legacy into the emerging Christian worldview. The reinterpretation of resurrection and salvation as exclusive to Jesus allowed the hybrid faction to align itself with the universalism of Serapis worship, while asserting the superiority of their narrative. This conflict highlights the inherent fluidity of religious identity. Rather than a clear-cut victory of one faith over another, the hybrid faction's success represented a reconstitution of religious tradition. By absorbing the theological framework of Serapis worship, the faction reshaped Christianity into a faith that could appeal to the Roman Empire. This process of transformation illustrates how religious traditions evolve through adaptation, borrowing, and redefinition in the face of internal and external challenges. The hybrid faction's ability to integrate and redefine the Serapis tradition was central to its establishment as the dominant Christian theology. This transformation ensured the survival of key elements of Egyptian religiosity, albeit under a Christian guise. More importantly, it reshaped the contours of Christianity itself, allowing it to emerge as a universal faith capable of encompassing and transcending its origins. The emergence of Christianity in Egypt cannot be disentangled from the profound influence of Serapis worship. The theological and ritualistic framework of the Serapis cult, focused on themes of resurrection, salvation, and cosmic mediation, serve as the fertile ground upon which early Christian tradition was built. The first Christians in Egypt, far from rejecting these elements, embraced and reinterpreted them within the context of their evolving faith. However, this continuity also set the stage for a defining conflict within the Christian movement. The struggle between the Serapis-centered Christians and a hybrid faction that sought to integrate Serapis into the narrative of Jesus as the Christ was inevitable. In the context of early Egyptian Christianity, to be anti-Christ initially implied opposition to Serapis. The term reflected a deep-seated antagonism toward the older theological framework that was foundational to the Serapis-centered worship. This opposition was rooted in the hybrid faction's effort to distance itself from Serapis worship and redefine Christian identity. The hybrid faction actively sought to delegitimize the Serapis-centered Christians, portraying their practices and beliefs as remnants of a pagan past incompatible with the emerging orthodoxy. This reinterpretation reframed opposition to Serapis as a necessary rejection of a flawed or heretical understanding of salvation. As the hybrid faction gained dominance, the figure of Serapis became increasingly linked to the Antichrist archetype, representing the pagan opposition to the new Christian narrative. This deliberate conflation allowed the hybrid movement to consolidate its theological position and assert its authority over the broader Christian community in Egypt and Rome. The theological innovations of the Serapis cult, such as mystical purification, communal meals, and the promise of resurrection, were not discarded but adapted by the hybrid faction. These practices were reframed as uniquely Christian, with Jesus positioned as the true Savior who fulfilled the spiritual promise once attributed to Serapis. This transformation allowed the hybrid faction to become appealing to the then religious world, crafting a narrative that absorbed the universality of Serapis worship while asserting the supremacy of Jesus. The birth of Christianity in Egypt is thus inseparable from the worship of Serapis. The first Christians, shaped by the rich theological and ritualistic traditions of Serapis, laid the foundations for a faith that would evolve through conflict and negotiation. The struggle between the Serapis-centered Christians and the Jesus-centered faction represents a profound movement of religious transformation, where identity was contested, redefined, and then ultimately reshaped. The eventual dominance of the new Jesus Serapis Christian faction marked not just the rise of a new orthodoxy, but the reconstitution of faith itself, a process that absorbed the legacy of Serapis while striving to erase his memory. This conflict, far from being a simple victory of one tradition over another, highlights the fluidity and adaptability of religious identity in a pluralistic society. It underscores how the origins of Christianity in Egypt were deeply intertwined with and ultimately transformed by the worship of Serapis, a deity whose legacy continues to echo in the foundational narratives of the Christian theory.